episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Vicki Odino. I'm with the Atlas Society, the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in creative ways, such as through animated videos and graphic novels. Today, we will be discussing current events with a panel consisting of our very own Atlas Society scholars, founder David Kelley, philosopher Stephen Hicks, and economist Richard Salsman. We'll also save time at the end to take some audience questions. So throughout the discussion, feel free to type in your questions into the Zoom Q&A section or the chat, or if you're watching us live on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube, you can just type your questions into the comment stream. Today, we're going to cover three areas: the Derek Chauvin verdict in Minneapolis, gun control, and COVID success stories. So thanks for joining us, and let's get started with the first topic. Yesterday afternoon, the country was anxiously awaiting the verdict in the George Floyd case in Minneapolis. And I live in downtown Chicago, and for the past week, workers have been sawing and drilling, boarding up storefronts on Michigan Avenue and adjacent streets in anticipation of the verdict. And that's a scene that was repeated in cities across the country. Politicians, celebrities, and other public figures made it clear that anything other than a guilty verdict on all three counts would result in disturbances. The jury came back with guilty verdicts on all three, and thankfully, the streets remained peaceful overnight. While I don't want to necessarily discuss whether the jury made the right decision, I do want to discuss the overall process. One of the concerns I have is that the jury was not sequestered and the trial not moved to a different jurisdiction. So what is the probability that this jury was influenced by the protests over the last year, riots in the city over the past week, politicians calling for the right verdict, cancellations of in-person school, and the postponement of pro sports events? And how does any such influence impact the rule of law? So I'm going to start with you, Richard.
Very good, thank you. I have the same concerns, and another part of that was a payment from the city or from the state to the Floyd family in advance of the verdict as well. So that could be seen as another case of influencing the jury. Yeah, and they would be more likely to be influenced if not sequestered. I just wanted to make three main points. The first one about juries generally. I think it's interesting in mostly Anglo-American law that there's a presumption of innocence. We're all familiar with that. But there's also kind of a norm associated with the presumption that the jury gets it right. You know, that it's not infallible or never not biased, but in a system where they see the facts, they have the facts way more than we do as outsiders, and guided by a judge who seems to be fair, and this one did seem to be fair, reading them basically the rule book. I think it is fair enough to say this was probably a correct decision. I'm only a bit confused, and I do know a bit about law, that they basically threw every possible charge at him other than murder one, and they are somewhat in conflict. So murder two basically has some intent in it, but it's intent during the act. In other words, it's not premeditated, not planned well out in advance. But they did basically charge him with wanting to kill Floyd during the act, which is really quite remarkable because it was in broad daylight with everyone watching. So that is quite a remarkable thing. And third degree murder, if you know, is negligence, you know, which is like inadvertently, killing someone with due to a car accident or something like that. He was also convicted of that, which is somewhat contradictory to the idea that he intended it. But leaving that aside, I think the biggest question we might want to think about is whether as Vicki said, juries are being tampered with, in effect, by outside pressure. So you think of a case like this, and if you recall back to the original incident in May of 2020, pretty much everyone who saw the final 10 minutes thought it was awful. There was almost no one who said that was a proper use of force. Now, if the jury had been gathered the very next day, had the trial gone on the very next day, and which is impossible, of course, and then we got the verdict we just got, does that mean there would not have been any violence for a year, no outcries and things like that? In other words, if you truncate the whole thing, the act itself seemed atrocious. It seemed atrocious to all eyes. And then the jury and the judge just said the same thing. So what is all the hue and cry about systemic racism, defund the police, systemic racism within the cops. You know, there isn't really any evidence in this trial that it was a race-based act. So that these are other things that make me worried. Not that the jury didn't get it right, not that the jury wasn't being objective, but in the context of all the violence surrounding it, it's hard to be sure that they weren't affected by that thing. And I think that's a very sad story in regards to looking at judicial decisions. Now, I only have a couple more. I just want to quote a couple of important officials in response to this, because it suggests that this kind of questioning of the justice system itself will continue to go on, and I think in a somewhat non-objective way. So, for example, the Attorney General of Minnesota, Ellison, said in response, "I do not call today's verdict justice, because justice implies true restoration, but it is accountability." So that you have the top law enforcement officer in Minnesota, basically saying it's not an act of justice. The verdict is not just. That seems a bit incendiary to me. Now, the Police Officers Foundation, I thought was interesting. The Police Officers Foundation of Minneapolis said, "There are no winners in this case, and we respect the jury's decision," interestingly. But then it says, "We need the political pandering to stop and the race baiting of elected officials to stop. In addition, we need to stop the divisive comments," unquote. Now, the vice president and the president came out. In both cases, they referred to the country still being laced with systemic racism. I mean, they applauded the verdict, but they still repeated, I think, an unfounded charge that America is systemically racist. So Harris, for example, quote, "A measure of justice was done, but a measure of justice isn't the same as equal justice," unquote. So she's still suggesting that this is a system not of equal justice. It's basically, in her view, racial injustice, that the races are unequally treated in the courts. So she says we still must reform the system. Well, that's not all that surprising, but she says America has a long history of systemic racism. That's an interesting formulation, because you could say objectively that, for the opening decades and up and at least until, say, the Jim Crow laws were repealed, there was systemic racism, but it's quite an overgeneralization to say the long history, meaning the entire history, is systemic racism. So I think that's a bit disturbing. Now here's another formulation. Black Americans have been treated throughout the course of American history as less than human, unquote. That's the Vice President of the United States. That is a bit, I think, strong and wrong. Biden, I won't go a lot into Biden, but systematic racism as well, repeated the argument that it was systematic racism still in the country. I'll leave you lastly with something I thought was very philosophical, actually, coming from Nancy Pelosi, of all people, because this is a very odd take, but a very philosophic take on the whole thing. So she had a press conference and she said the following: "Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice. For calling out to your mom that I can't breathe. Because of you and because of millions of people in the world who came out to protest for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice," unquote. So I think this idea of, and I'm just trying to imagine George Floyd goes out that day, as a kind of Jesus figure, eager and interested in sacrificing himself for the greater good of, that's how Nancy Pelosi is portraying it, which I think is, I don't even know how to describe that other than not just inaccurate, but somewhat of almost an insult, maybe even to George Floyd. The guy's going out, and whether he passed a bad bill or not, he was not looking to sacrifice himself for the greater good of Nancy Pelosi's cause. So, but this idea of sainthood and sacrifice going together is very common in altruism, as you know. And the idea that this is synonymous with justice, well, of course it isn't. That's the idea of self-sacrificing and sacrificing for the sake of others who are guilty, but you're not, is the epitome of injustice, not justice. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to bring out those points and leave it at that.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate that. David, you have anything you want to add?
Sure. 2 points. The first is about the rule of law. in my view, the law is one of two fields that have the most highly developed standards of applied epistemology, the other being science. Epistemology in general gives us canons for reasoning that apply across all fields, but each field has to develop its own applied techniques, standards, methods to deal with the specific and highly complex issues it deals with. And I think the legal system, like scientific method, is one of our best examples of that. The law has been developed over centuries, involving the adversarial system, the burden of proof principle, and a very, very detailed, complex law of evidence that has evolved over centuries, going back to British law. So for that reason, I almost never second guess jury verdicts. There are exceptions. O.J. Simpson, I thought, was a circus, but in this case, that's almost never. I don't have the evidence that the juries had, and I don't hold the fate of another person in my hands. And that was my first thought late last May when the incident occurred. I thought it looks bad, but I don't go by a single video, and this will be dealt with in the law. But I think I was in a fairly small minority in that way, because millions of people, or at least thousands, hundreds of thousands probably, were on the streets demonstrating, and as if they'd already decided this guy was guilty. Even President Biden jumped the gun, and the others that Richard mentioned. So I'm glad the trial took place, and I have no second guessing about the results. We may learn more if it goes to appeal or whatever. But for now, the jury has spoken, and I would have been equally satisfied had the verdict been acquittal on one or more counts. The law, I would still regard it as a case of the law working. That is almost, there are very few people who I think could honestly say that. Certainly to judge all the mobs. And that brings me to the second point, which it kind of echoes what Richard was saying. The guilt of Chauvin was required to sustain their narrative of racism and systemic racism. It was required by the narrative, and people clearly, I think, were conducting themselves by the narrative, not by the facts. They were not, whatever the jury verdict would have been, it had to be guilty on all counts. And this has been backed up in particular by the idea that there's been an epidemic of shooting of Black people by officers. And it's true that the percentage of Blacks among people shot by cops is higher than the percentage of Blacks in the population, yes. But in absolute numbers, more whites are shot by police than Blacks. And the percentage of crimes committed by Blacks is higher than their share of the population. So you have to, and those are only two of the zillion statistics you can find out there. It's been studied. There's very little evidence that I've seen that policing is racist. And I'm not aware, correct me anyone if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware that any accusation of racism was introduced in the trial as Chauvin's motive.
Right.
So everything that's happening since then and around it, all the jubilation on the part of people who were, insisting on a certain outcome, was interpretive, an interpretation of this as a comment or an incident relevant to racism, when as far as I can see, the trial had nothing to do with that. And that just tells me that as much as I value the rule of law and respect the trial, the way it was conducted, as far as I know, as an instance of the rule of law, I think that what we have today is the rule of law is kind of an island in a sea of mob psychology, jumping to conclusions, being governed by narratives. So I, I take hope in the fact that the law worked. The law was conducted with some irregularities, perhaps. I take a lot of fear in the surrounding sea that I mentioned.
Thanks, David. And we're spending a little bit longer on this topic, but I think it's really important. I mean, this just happened yesterday. So I really do want to hear, Stephen, what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I wanted to just contribute from my perch inside of higher education. Richard is asking about the hue and cry, and David is talking about the narrative and the broader sea culture at work. And so my point just will be about the contribution of higher education over especially the last generation. The theme of the presumption of innocence and due process that are cherished in American, British, more broadly Western legal tradition have been to a significant extent eroded in higher education over the past 2 generations. And this is important because this is where still the vast majority of professional track educated people spend a significant amount of their time, and they're not exposed to it in the way that people were 50 years ago. And that's going to spill out into the more general culture. Now, we've seen it more specifically on any time that there is an interrace or an intergender or interethnic or interreligious conflict, that the presumption of innocence is very quickly set aside in universities and colleges' internal procedures. Presumption of innocence and as well as various sorts of due process are very quickly set aside. And so there's developed a whole culture of there's a more or less right answer expected, and the university is tracking onto what that previously expected right answer is going to be. Now, we can blame a lot of this to kind of a generic postmodernism that has been ascendant, obviously, in higher education for a while. The idea that there is no such thing as objectivity, there are no individual rights, the idea of evidence and logic and civil argument back and forth, even on issues about which we profoundly disagree. Largely, that has been assaulted by postmodernism and the large number of students who have signed on in various degrees to postmodernism. They will then graduate as human beings who don't really have any confidence or expectation that the broader legal system is going to follow into those, or along with those precepts. Another sign of this has been over the course of the last generation. I've noticed this specifically, and I've done a little research tracking this, is the decline of honor codes within universities and colleges. And part of the liberal arts ideal has been to say that students should not be under any sort of authoritarian education, that students need to take ownership of their education, but they also need to take ownership of all of the organizations and have student government and have an honor court to deal with cases of plagiarism and academic dishonesty and so on. And part of this is part of the liberal art education ideal of teaching university students how to become citizens in a broader liberal democratic republic. But there has been a wholesale abandonment of honor codes in colleges and universities over the last generation. They're replaced by various sorts of compliance codes, to put it bluntly, where there are speech codes and there are various procedures that are going to be performed by the faculty and by the administrations, and students are expected to do what they are told. So what we have then is a whole generation of students who are not learning the do-it-yourself element of it. They don't know what these things mean in practice. They are at most just general principles that might have been floated to them in their 8th grade civics class, and that's about all it really means. I'm starkly overstating the case. Honor codes aren't dead in all institutions, but there has been a wholesale decline, and I think that does contribute to the way lots of educated people have been acting in the protests and so forth.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. If anybody has any questions on this particular topic, go ahead right now and put those in the chat box or whatever platform you're on in the comments section. We'll get to the questions after we finish our 3 topics, but feel free to put those questions in at any time. The next topic is gun control. And sadly, mass shootings have topped the news yet again, the most recent in Indianapolis, where 8 people were killed. And as expected, what follows is a call for more gun restrictions against civilians. During the election, Biden and many other Democrats promised to come for guns. And a couple of weeks ago, Biden introduced 6 gun control executive orders that he wants to implement, noting that, quote, "There's no reason someone needs a weapon of war with 100 rounds, 100 bullets that can be fired from a weapon," end quote. People often talk about allowing firearms for hunting and for self-defense, but an important reason for the Second Amendment that's often neglected in the public discussion is repelling a tyrannical government, which would require more than 10 rounds. Is this a reasonable concern? And let's start with you, David.
Oh, okay. I looked at one of the most famous Supreme Court decisions on gun rights was the Heller decision in, I believe, 2006 in pertaining to a Washington, D.C. draconian limitation on gun ownership, basically a ban. And just a small point here, but it was interesting to me that the brief written by Justice Scalia went to some pains to distinguish the preface to the Second Amendment, which reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state." That's the preamble that states why we're going to have this amendment. But then the amendment goes on, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And Scalia's main argument, and the court's main finding, is that the preamble does not restrict the right. The right is quite general of the people to keep and bear arms, whether, especially for self-defense, but also for hunting and so forth. So I think I would say, it's relevant to distinguish the case of the militia. That's not to say I disagree that that is an important reason for gun ownership. And apparently there was a long history lying behind the amendment. So it's not surprising to me that militia issue has been somewhat neglected. In any case, I think there's not a question in my mind that people should have that right, because the government, we basically concede to the government the right to prosecute and protect us against crime and deter crime, to avoid the chaos of anarchism. That's fine, but self-defense remains an important area in cases where there is crime, and for that reason, I think it's an absolute human right. The question is, what kind of arms? And I'm not an expert in this, but I think we have to think of it as a spectrum from, say, guns, all the way up to machine guns, howitzers, tanks, small nuclear devices in your closet. And in the law, there is a doctrine of strict negligence that says if you do something that is inherently dangerous to other people, you are responsible for all results, regardless of whether it was your fault or not. You take on that responsibility. And so I would think of putting the gun right issue and the limits on it in terms of degree of lethality under that kind of regime. And beyond a certain point, you should not have those weapons. Let me turn this over to Richard and Stephen, who I'm sure know much more about this than I do.
Stephen, why don't we go to you first?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I know more about this than David does, but I would second certainly the gist of his points. I do think the Second Amendment is a universal principle and it is absolute, right? I think both of those features are important. But at the same time, it is a right that does need to be contextualized. And I do think some kinds of restrictions are appropriate in different contexts. So if we say, for example, that the right to self-defense is a universal and timeless absolute principle. We all have that right. We are delegating portions of that to the government on our behalf, but we don't alienate that our right by delegating some of it to the government. At the same time, what the right to self-defense implies if I'm living in a major urban area, say like I'm walking around in Manhattan regularly, compared to what this right to self-defense would require if I'm living in a small Alaska town with lots of wilderness surrounding me, it is a contextual judgment about what range of weapons are necessary for me to appropriately engage in self-defense. So I'm open to the idea that Alaska would have different kinds of restrictions compared to a city like Manhattan. Or to stick with the Manhattan example, I'm not going to go with the tactical nukes the way David did, but I just imagine walking around in the streets of Manhattan. It seems perfectly reasonable that I would be open to or have the right to carry around a knife or a handgun, but something like a grenade would not be an appropriate weapon for me to carry around, partly because knives and handguns I can control, and the range of negligent homicide that's going to result from that is totally under my control. But if I'm planning to use a hand grenade for self-defense, I can't control that. I'm putting myself in an inherently, potentially negligent circumstance. And so a restriction on a hand grenade, I'm open to the arguments on that sort of thing as well. So that's a quick comment. I've got a couple of other things, but as Vicky pointed out, we're running short on time, so I'll cycle back if there's time.
Okay,
Well,
so go ahead, Richard.
Stephen went contextual, so I'll go textual. So the Second Amendment text interests me a lot because the word infringe, which is used here, is really quite delicate, isn't it? I mean, infringe, that is really a restriction on the government doing much of anything regarding your right to bear arms. There's another textual point, which is interesting. Bear arms. I mean, arms is short for armaments. Doesn't say you have a right to bear arms, so long as they're not weapons of war, so long as they don't, include a magazine of more than X rounds. So that's interesting too, to me. And also, David, I think your point about the preamble and Scalia's, I know the militia is part of the preamble, but more interesting to me is the free state idea. So it's almost as if the founders are saying this right includes the important principle of preserving freedom. And if a government is coming at you, an authoritarian, and it's warring against you, that to me is the hint that this right should include rights to bear arms to protect yourself from your own government. On the other hand, listening to what Stephen said, I think the context is something like this. If at some point you could designate that the government is at war with you, the old adage of all is fair in love and war, all bets are off, including the Constitution, and it's just going to be a mad grab for weapons and guns. So that makes me not all that eager to say that people can hold weapons of war. So I'm sympathetic, in other words, with the argument that you can't really hold weapons of war if you're not at war. But the delicate thing there is you can lose this overnight. I mean, they can ban guns and they're at war with you and you're now defenseless. And now what do? You have to charge, the local arms cache. One thing I'll leave you with is just backing up as to why there are these mass shootings. It might interest the audience to know that if you read John Lott's work, Lott is the expert, L-O-T-T, John Lott. There's a book he wrote called, I think it's called More Guns, Less Crime. John found out that 95%, something like 90 or 95% of the multiple victim shootings in America in the last 50 years have been in gun-free zones. So when you think of what a gun-free zone is, it is specifically a zone that bars Second Amendment rights. So the argument could be the real trouble here is there's not sufficient Second Amendment rights in certain pockets. David talked about an island and a sea of mob mentality. These little pockets of gun-free zones carved out in wherever, post offices, where people go postal, or elementary schools. It's an invitation for crazies to go in knowing they're going to meet no resistance. So that is something I've never seen the gun control advocates handle. And it ties back to the Second Amendment, because you're basically saying these are pockets where you don't have Second Amendment rights. And notice that's where all the trouble is. So, for mass shootings, at least. So I'll leave it at that.
Richard, I actually have a question, if you don't mind. An argument that I often hear, and this is often from people who don't know a lot about history, but that this idea that we're going to face a tyrannical government is absurd, conspiracy theory, exaggeration. How do you respond to that?
I think you have to have some kind of measure or sense of what a totalitarian government is. I mean, I think even Ayn Rand said something about if they close the borders, if they shut down free speech. I think banning reasonable weapons would be an example, or confiscations. I mean, they've happened in places like Australia and elsewhere, but no one would call Australia a totalitarian government. So I think, Vicky, some kind of measure of when it's becoming totalitarian is required, but it's not, I don't think it's a precise measure. But historically, cases of Weimar Germany and Mussolini's Italy, they did confiscate weapons. And at a certain point, sometimes over the weekend. So sometimes these things can be abrupt and clearly measurable. And then, basically all hell breaks loose and it's almost like anarchy. But then they have all the guns and you don't. I think in America, gun ownership is so widespread, actually, and becomes more widespread with every threat, actually, from gun controllers, that from a practical standpoint, I have a hard time believing there ever could be widespread gun banning or confiscation in the US. But they are using other methods like restricting ammo. You can't get ammo. There's ammo shortages all over the US. So, or they're trying to make gun manufacturers liable legally for deaths. So to the extent they run gun makers out of business, there are these other avenues they're pursuing to make it almost practically impossible to bear arms, quite apart from whether they repeal the Second Amendment.
Let me piggyback on this, especially at the fear of tyrannical government. I've had a large number of informal conversations with people in the United States and in Canada. And I think the background cultural set is much less sophisticated and not at all focused on constitutional interpretations and so on. Instead, what my sense is from these discussions is that if you go through the potential legitimate purposes of owning a gun, hunting, target practice, and maybe self-defense with respect to your fellow citizens and or with respect to the government, it's a pre-political view that none of those really are legitimate or realistic. So the people I talk with, they will just say, hunting. Well, what kind of people go hunting, right? Those are not fully civilized people. And there's not a legitimate purpose from that perspective. What kind of purpose a person wants to go to a shooting range and try all kinds of guns and just shoot things and so forth, right? That's just not a morally healthy person. So respecting that person's right is further down. And then part of it does come from a sense that we are living in a highly civilized society, and we have delegated self-defense to the police, and the system, it works pretty good. We don't really need to have personal firearms and so forth because it's already being looked out for us. And the idea that the Canadian government or even the American government is going to turn into a tyrannical dictatorship, that's just outer space aliens kind of stuff. So they can't even get to the point of taking seriously the idea that there are principled values and principled constitutional interpretations that would legitimate the other side's position.
Vicky, may I just interject quickly? The point you made, Stephen, about the self-defense, and it's been studied that the response times for the police is so long that they become, in effect, they become note takers who show up at the scene afterwards and take down the facts and the claims and then hand them over to the detective. So that's another reason to say, listen, I should be able to hold arms until the police come. And so I've delegated this authority, but that doesn't mean they're going to be on my front lawn, the minute I'm being accosted. So,
One of the big mysteries to me in this debate has been the perspective of women who seem overwhelmingly in favor of gun control when with respect to exactly that issue, rape culture and so forth, that are
Yeah.
strongly afraid of, the police are not going to arrive quickly enough to end the sexual assault or the rape or whatever it is. But the gun is the great equalizer, right? So if you want equal rights, then have equal power, right? So a 120-pound woman with a gun can take out any 200-pound man and so forth.
Thanks. I know for me, one of the things that always strikes me is whatever you think of President Trump, but the call that he was a tyrant and at the same time then trying to take people's guns away, which makes no sense to me. But what do I know? All right, let's move on to our next topic, which we specifically wanted to do something a little bit more positive today instead of focusing on so much negative. And one of the things is that we do have some COVID success stories. For one, we have the rapid sequencing of COVID and the incredibly fast development of COVID vaccines. So I'm wondering, what does this say about scientific discovery and innovation, and about the position of the United States, considering that 3 of the 6 primary vaccines were developed in the United States, with one that was a co-product with the German team? And also, what about the drive to reduce the obstacles that are created by the government and the FDA when it comes to bringing pharmaceuticals and other products to market? So why don't I start with you, Stephen, on that?
Yeah, amidst all of the gloomy news and gloomy trends that are out there, I found myself impressed and encouraged by a huge amount of the COVID reaction, despite all the inefficiencies and so forth that were going on there. But it is extraordinarily impressive, the science of immunology, the science of pandemics, now compared to a generation ago, compared to a century ago. And I find myself cheering every time I read the journalistic accounts of what was going on in the labs in response to the outbreak of the pandemic. I mean, never before in history has been there such fast development of new knowledge and sharing across borders, right, of the knowledge to operationalize it, as has occurred just in the past year or so. And so I do want to celebrate that. And then on top of that, the very quick biological engineering that was going on, working with the business structure, the incredibly sophisticated logistics structures nationally and internationally that have been developed over the course of the last 2 generations. All of that has been extraordinarily impressive and unprecedented. So I do want to underscore that. I know another element of this is those of us interested in entrepreneurship and policies bearing on entrepreneurship and innovation, and bemoaning various kinds of obstacles and so on. It is a striking fact that of the 6 major operative vaccines that have been developed over the past year, 3 of them were developed in the United States. One was co-developed with a German team. And of course, there's the Chinese one, the Russian one, and the British one. And then there are 2 others that are fairly far along in development, one of them also in the United States. So if we count all of those, that's 8 of them. Fully 50% of them are developed in the United States. So this is to speak somewhat parochially then about American innovation policy and then the state of innovation in the US. And it does strike me as, at least by relative international standards, things are as good in the United States as they are or can be expected to be. So I don't necessarily see that we are in a decline state, whatever problems we have with particularly policies that bear upon entrepreneurship and innovation. And then, of course, the rate of innovation by historical standards is, again, unprecedented. So I think there's a lot of good news there. Vicki mentioned in her preamble to this the role of the FDA. It is striking that in previous pandemics, the FDA has been berated for being an obstacle to the development and releasing of various kinds of treatments, or even experimenting with various kinds of treatments in the AIDS epidemic with respect to medical marijuana, with all sorts of cancer treatments and so on. And I do think that a lot of the beating up upon the FDA that's been occurring over the last 30 to 40 years did finally get some traction this time around. And one of the reasons why we haven't had to wait 3, 4, 8 years for anti-COVID vaccinations to come out is the effectiveness of learning from those past historical records. So I do think another point of optimism coming out of all of this just is that there's a much greater chance that there will be significant FDA reforms as a result of that. And due to that, we will have pharmaceuticals coming out at a much faster rate. And additionally, companies won't be carrying their hundreds of millions of dollars of development costs for multiple years or decades. So the cost of the new pharmaceuticals, once they're released, will be significantly lower. So those are two very positive trends.
Before I go to you, Richard, I just wanted to point out Lawrence Borland mentioned that the application for patent rights have avoided using the word vaccine because the shots do not make the classical definition of vaccine. So I did just want to point that out. And Richard, what do you have to say about this?
Well, just very quick, I really want to resist being pessimistic at all in trailing Stephen's comments. So I'll try to focus on, so my angle here is hoping, I did say that 3 times, hoping that people would speak and think more kindly of pharmaceutical companies. So I think the hate, I've noticed it in academia and elsewhere, the hatred for pharmaceutical companies is so great. Now, is it because, is that going to happen because of this? It's a one-off. I don't expect the hatred to go away. And the other thing is, I think because people would just show up and get the shot without paying for it because it was subsidized, that's kind of an artificial loving of the pharma companies because they typically don't charge nothing for their vaccines. But I totally endorse what Stephen is saying. I think it really is good news. And just to throw in one other piece of good news, but it's not really our topic, I think the whole Zoom teleconferencing technology, I think that was an amazing achievement as well. It's not like these technologies didn't exist previously, but the way they were ramped up so quickly with so few crashes and so few mess ups, and it's just, I think it's just remarkable. And I think that's going to be a kind of permanent change where people got used to the idea of interacting with each other without having to travel long distances, waste a lot of time and money. And so it's not quite related to pharma, although there is such a thing as telemedicine, where doctors are performing and diagnosing from afar. That's been going on for a while. But that's another piece of good news, I think, coming out of this whole event.
Nice.
Vicki, if I could just jump in for a sec, I've got it's more of a question for Stephen and for Richard, if you know. When pandemic came along and the vaccine development began, most of the reports said, oh, it'll take years. And then Trump made what everyone thought was the ridiculous claim, we'll have a vaccine by the end of the year. And then as time went on, it began to look more and more possible. And that was amazing, and it is amazing. But I was reading something about the beginning of it back in actually last February, possibly earlier, that people were aware of the COVID the virus, and there had been development on, I believe it was called messenger RNA, that was then tapped for at least some of the vaccines. And so there was, this is not to take away from the people who actually created the vaccine, but there was a lot of work, prior work that went into it. And to me, that is another sign of what is great about science and the context of objectivity and freedom of exchange of information that science represents. And in some ways, you can make a case that it's represented best in American science. Not to the exclusion, there are many brilliant scientists elsewhere, but our institutional structure, I think, contributed a lot to the results that we're getting, which are indeed amazing.
Yeah,
I'll put that as a question.
Well, that's a question I would just say yes.
Okay.
Well said. Yes.
Well, let me say something that bridges what you two are saying, which I think might be interesting to people. The epistemology of how public health did this. By that, I mean the epidemiology, projections leading to lockdowns. I think there's abundant evidence that kind of scare forecasts that led the way to massive lockdowns was a major public health, public policy blunder. Now, this set up against what Stephen is talking about, which is an amazing scientific process within these private corporations. So maybe I'm imagining too much here, but I'm imagining a wildly different performance by the profit-oriented Pfizer's, Moderna's, and others of the world, and the 8 or 6 that you mentioned, Stephen, and the rather shabby, terrible performance of Fauci, the CDC, the WHO, all these non-profit-oriented public health. So there's a real clash there, and looking out in the future for there to be continued strong and good and scientific performance by the pharmas, they're going to have to be left private. But there are challenges, as you know. Even Trump wanted to impose, and I think as they've begun to impose price controls on pharma. And to the extent we move towards socialized medicine, as they did in Britain and elsewhere, the whole history of that has been to eradicate pharma companies. So Switzerland, Britain, all sorts of other Anglo countries had decent pharma companies until they adopted socialized medicine. Then they basically said, we're going to pay you a small amount for these things. And they basically folded up, left, or merged with American companies. So Stephen, I agree with you that there's this amazing brainiac brain power within pharma. But the reason I think it's concentrated in the US is we have not yet socialized medicine. And if we keep going down this route, 20 years from now, there won't be any decent pharma companies to do the kind of things they just did. That's what I worry about. So that would be an argument for continuing to defend these pharma companies and their rights.
Thanks, Richard.
Well said.
Oh, go ahead, Stephen.
No, I was just saying, well said. Yeah, the science and the epistemology and the institutional culture there is still by and large very healthy.
Yeah.
As we have always been saying for years now, it's on the political economy that the disasters are.
Yeah.
Well, let me take this opportunity to invite you again to submit any questions that you might have. You can do it either on the Zoom chat or on any of the platforms in the comments section. And we do have a couple of questions that I do want to get to. One is from Tom Alvord, and he says, speaking of free speech, Ayn Rand said the time for revolution is when we lose free speech. Is that happening now? Is it too late?
Well, I would
Go
say,
ahead, David.
we should keep in mind in a point that Rand made, that censorship is an act of government. It's a coercive act involving force to shut people up or punish them for what they've said. What is too often described as censorship, the kind of thing that Facebook and other social media companies do when they will not, when they drop a post or will not allow it to go up. As private companies, that is their editorial choice. We can object to it. And in a competitive marketplace, if competition is free, despite their mammoth size, it can be fought by other venues and other speakers. Universities are a special problem because of the vast government funding that when you build a cancel culture and limitations on academic freedom on top of government subsidies and support, that's another problem. But I mean, I think what we were talking about a moment ago with the just the explosion and combination of cooperative and competitive scientific activity on the part of the pharma companies tells us that free speech is not dead. So I would say, no, we're nowhere near that time. And that's not the only condition. as important as it is.
Well, I also want to point out Lawrence Borland also mentioned that he has been a physician for 45 years, and he says we're well along the way to centralized control, and there's kind of mass retirements going on among physicians. So I did want to point that out as well. Let me ask another question. Philip really has asked, did you watch the Oz police takedowns during lockdown? Did anybody here see any video of the police? Obviously, Australia has
by Oz, he means Australia, specifically in the state of Victoria, and then more specifically in Melbourne.
Yes.
Yeah, there was some eye-opening stuff there that tags on to Richard's point about how quickly tyrannical restrictions can be enforced. It wasn't gun takeaways, but it was a matter of, we all think of as Australians as highly civilized, although enjoying their beers and Barbies, kinds of people. But even in a relatively relaxed culture there, the authoritarian reaction and enforcement in jackboot fashion, just overnight, it was shocking and eye-opening. So yes, we need to be very vigilant.
And I appreciate you pointing out that it's a good example of tyranny happening very quickly.
Yeah.
Eric Kalin asks, would any of the three gentlemen agree that government has no proper role in fighting the flu and similar threats to health, other than perhaps restricting the movement of people known to be contagious? Richard, what do you think about that?
Yes, I think the government has no role. I don't think there should be an FDA. I don't think there should be a CDC could be easily privatized. I think it began as a privatized. I don't think there should be an NIH, especially the way they fund junk science. So I think the NSF would be another example of this, the National Science Foundation. Yeah, I think the whole issue of public health, if it's defined as the way health can affect the public, that's obviously a field of study. But yes, I would be against the government having a role of this the broad way they have now. Yeah.
Let me follow that up with, do you think they have a role in restricting the movement of people who we know are contagious with some disease?
I don't know about that, but I remember writing in last April something to the effect of the government should come out and announce and make it very clear that if you know you have sickness and you're out there, then you're negligent. Now, is that the same as quarantining people and telling them where to live and move and stuff? I'm very reluctant to go to that second part. But the first part is if you just put people on notice for a particular, obviously on the books thing already, namely torts, the whole tort system, you cannot inflict a wrong on others knowingly. I think they just should have made a statement like that. Not that people out of self-interest wouldn't quarantine themselves. They would. I mean, anybody wakes up with a cold usually calls the boss and says, I'm not coming in. I mean, nobody, and then the boss says, if you dare come in, I'm not letting you come in. So these things are handled voluntarily in ways people can't imagine or don't seem to imagine. They feel the need that government has to control the whole thing centrally. But that's the most I can think they should do, come out and remind people that they're obliged not to hurt others unknowingly. And it could be proved in a court that you went out, this came up in the mid-80s with AIDS. People were said, you cannot run around if you have AIDS and go to bathhouses and do things where you are knowingly transmitting this, or you're going to be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. So that would be a great deterrent, I think, without the government being the command and control, doing it in the command and control way.
Yeah.
In the case
David.
Of COVID, I would just I'd maybe go a step further than Richard, because this was a new virus. We did not have experience with it as we had with the flu and the cold, but it was known very, very early that you were contagious before you had symptoms yourself. So people were in the position of not knowing how they could comply, whether they had to comply with such a government mandate, as Richard was suggesting, which I agree with. So, and given everything else that was unknown, I think it might have been a valid exercise of caution to put some restrictions on until people had learned enough to be able to do everything privately without these, hideous lockdowns. And
just adding to what both Richard and David are saying, when I think about this, I think there's two relevant dimensions to attend to before we consider public policy implications. And the vast majority of this is going to be sorted out by private, self-responsible individuals and organizations along the lines Richard suggested. But the way we take David's point, the diseases and conditions can be arrayed along a spectrum from low contagion to high contagion. And so that's one relevant dimension. So, getting AIDS, for example, is low contagion. It's hard to get AIDS.
Right.
Or you have to get a blood transfusion or have sex with someone who's got the condition. On the other hand, a cold, my understanding, is pretty high contagion. So we've got this one dimension.
Yeah.
Another dimension that's important, though, is the seriousness dimension, right? The cold is not that serious, right? On the other hand, if I get measles, that's more serious. If I do get AIDS, that's even more serious. So there's a seriousness dimension as well. And so I put those on a 2x2, or you get a 2x2 chart when you plot the two dimensions. So when you start to get into the one quadrant where these are highly contagious and highly serious conditions, and we're not sure that individuals and organizations are up the learning curve enough to be able to handle those things, then we might start thinking about government interventions and policies.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
it's a metric at least. Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
Well, why it's the sense of injustice, and I would absolutely agree with that. I'm going to end on, we've got one more question, and I'm hoping that this is ending on a positive note, but I've seen this question a number of times in other webinars, and this in particular was emailed to me. So let's see how we do. The question is, do you think the USA has reached the point of no return? So, Stephen, why don't you take that?
No return, reading between the lines of downward spiral into death and insignificance or something like that.
Let me finish. He says Thomas Sowell thinks that the election of President Biden, that it has. And he said, to be fair to Sowell, he doesn't think it's impossible to turn it around, but it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah. Well, I lean toward optimism. So I don't think I've seen any of the trends. We do have problems. We have some pretty significant problems. We've got lots of worrisome trends. At the same time, we've got an enormous number of very smart people. We've got lots of forums in which we can engage in all of these kinds of discussions. We're aware of what those issues are. We've got the resources to be able to handle them. So I think it will be messy and ugly in some cases, but we will, at worst, muddle along.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephen, David, Richard, and thank everyone for joining us today. Again, I'm Vicki Odino. If you enjoyed this video or any of our other materials, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org. And if I remember correctly, I think, Richard, you have a Morals and Market tomorrow?
Tomorrow night, environmentalism is anti-capitalism. So that's the title. And I think Dr. Kelley might be on with me. So we talked about that.
Nice.
So,
I'm looking forward to it.
And excellent. And you can go to our website to get more information about that. And then please tune in next week when Patry Friedman from Seasteading will be our guest for the Atlas Society Asks. And have a great week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thanks, Vicki. Nice guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Great job.